So when it comes to inoculants, inoculants are really, really important to any legume type crop. Specifically, you start to take a look within the southern ge Iowa geography. We're looking mainly at alfalfa and soybeans, and more particularly, a lot of times we're looking at soybeans. The reason inoculants are so important is because when it comes to it, it's what drives the nitrogen demands and needs for the soybean crop. Soybeans will actually take up more nitrogen than what most of our corn will throughout its life cycle. In fact, it takes roughly about uh, 5 pounds for every bushel of soybeans that you're going to produce. And as you can see from this chart here, we actually take a majority of that nitrogen off in the grain. Now, you guys might be questioning, well, then Tyler, why do we give when we have soybeans going to corn, why do we give it a credit uh, for the corn the next year having extra nitrogen? It's not the fact that we're producing any more nitrogen for that corn. It's the fact that we have such a low carbon to nitrogen ratio within that soybean residue from that previous crop. Okay, and it's because of its very high nitrogen demands that really drives that. So that carbon to nitrogen ratio, as it's breaking down that residue, then it will actually release nitrogen. Whereas corn stover, which has a very high carbon to nitrogen ratio, will tend to bind up corn or bind up that nitrogen in that plant residue. And so nitrogen uptake is extremely important to soybeans, and 60 to 70% of the nitrogen that is going to be utilized by that soybean has to come from the nodule. And so that nodule is so important to make sure we get good assessment and good infection within that root. Okay, and we've known this for a very long time. Here's a here's a really old picture of somebody inoculating soybeans clear back. This is 1928 from the University of Illinois. So this has been known for a very, very long time. Now there's different. So just to clarify, when you're talking about inoculating soybeans, basically what we're doing is we're introducing a bacterial product that it actually infects the soybean roots, and it forms what we call a symbiotic relationship. Now you got to understand that this symbiotic relationship, it's not like the soybeans are just getting free nitrogen. Okay, it goes both ways. So the soybean is actually feeding the bacteria with sugars, and the bacteria then is responding and giving, fixing atmospheric nitrogen for the plant. And so there's this balancing role that takes place. What's really interesting is when you start to look at the combination between those, that balancing role, if we start getting really good growing conditions, the plant will start to produce more sugars. And as it does that, as it produces more sugars, it will start to send more sugars into the root, which then will feed the rhizobium bacteria, stimulating them to produce more nitrogen for the crop. So it is a symbiotic relationship there. Now, if you look at the types of different bacteria that we utilize, basically for soybeans, we're looking at Bradyrhizobium japonicum. That one is going to be the one we're using for the soybean side. So, and you can see alfalfa, you can see some of the other ones, but we're really going to focus in on the Bradyrhizobium products. Okay. Now, when you start to look at the nodulization, basically this is just an infection into the root itself, that the root will actually physically house these bacteria. And they only work for a certain length of time. And you can tell if they're working by just cutting that open. And if there's a pink color to it, we know that that product, that nodule is still fixing nitrogen. Now, what's interesting is you start to take a look at the process here. A lot of times what we're trying to do with inoculum is we're basically spraying that on or somehow putting it on the seed coat, and then through some of the various factors within the plant is basically, as it starts to grow, starts to be stimulated to produce sugars that attract that rhizobium bacteria. And then a root hair will actually extend and form a system around that rhizobium bacteria, protecting it and forming that nodule. So basically, all that that nodule is a root hair that has formed around these rhizobium bacteria, and that's what forms the nodule. Okay, now this usually takes place around that V1, V2 time period. By V2, you're pretty much done starting that infection process. Beyond that, we don't see a lot of infection. And so this brings up a really good point. You know, if you're starting to think about high yield soybeans and really getting good rhizobium infection and inoculation, the key is we got to keep our nitrogen rates down. So, you know, you might be, for example, trying to push yields by putting out like an ATS or ammonium thiosulfate or maybe even AMS out there. Keep that nitrogen rate down below 25 pounds because I really don't want to overstimulate the soybeans and have them not form this association with this rhizobium bacteria. I give you a great example. We had a answer plot that I put up at Rudd, which is northern Iowa there, but similar kind of concept. The previous landowner, we didn't sign the contract real early, and so that previous landowner had put anhydrous ammonia out on the ground. Well, for heaven's sakes, I got plants that were taller, almost taller than me. They all fell over and they hardly produced anything. When you looked at the nodules, there's almost no nodules on that plant. And it's because I had so much free nitrogen in the soil that I couldn't get good inoculation. So that's a potential drawback if we have too much nitrogen in that system. If we're really looking at trying to get good rhizobium attraction to that root, we cannot have high levels of nitrogen. So once that nodule forms, then it will start to feed that rhizobium bacteria with sugars and allow then that nitrogen to be translocated into the plant. Okay, so it'll actually, you can see here, it forms a xylem region around that and allows then any nitrogen that's produced within that nodule to start to bleed out of that nodule and get into the plant. So here's the process. I know this is way more in depth than you ever wanted to go, but I know everybody's favorite subject is plant physiology, so I thought I'd include this. Understand that nitrogen fixation is a very energy intensive process. And that's why the plants do, in fact, have to supply sugar to the bacteria in order to get good nodulation and good nitrogen fixation. Okay. Here's some good examples, and these are some old pictures looking at inoculated versus uninoculated soybeans. You can see a big difference there. The biggest thing, guys, I would say with inoculation, here's the key ones to look at, okay? So when soybeans have not been planted within the field in the last 3 to 5 years, definitely need to inoculate. So if you've gone, for example, to alfalfa, if you've been corn on corn for 3 to 5 years, you need to have an inoculant. When in doubt, it's always good to inoculate, okay? Another one is if you have sandier soils, inoculation is always a good idea, okay? Because you got to imagine when you start looking at bacterial strains, they do not survive very well on their own when they're lacking water, okay? And so I'll give you a good example. You know, this past year, we were fairly dry in southern Iowa. If you're going for high yield soybeans, it's probably a pretty good idea to inoculate those soybeans because of how dry we are and the survivability of that bacteria, that rhizobium bacteria will go down. So that's a key factor as well. Okay, another key factor is pH. If you are dealing with high pH soils or recently lime soils that maybe have spiked in pH, the rhizobium bacteria do not survive well in those scenarios. And I know we don't have a lot of that across the southern geography of Iowa, but you may have situations where you've had to, you have a very low pH soil and you have to shock that system and get really a lot of lime out there. It's probably a good idea to inoculate soybeans that are going to be planted into that, just because you could see a spike in that pH level that could cause some of that inoculant to die off. Okay, so here's some good examples of inoculated versus non. You can just see some pictures. This is out in South Dakota to give you guys an example. It's pretty much universal when it comes to inoculants and the benefit of those. Okay. So really, guys, when it comes down to it, our key thing is we just want to make sure that we get really good inoculation because it takes such a high amount of nitrogen for it. So here's all the different factors that could cause some issues with survivability of rhizobium. If you have any of these types of situations, whether it be extreme soil pH, poorly drained, compacted soils, high soil temps, low moisture, soil erosion, soil nitrogen levels, soil treatments, chemicals, all of these different things can cause low survivability of rhizobium, and we need to then inoculate those crops. Because with a well-nodulated crop, you can fix over 250 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And that's absolutely key to get good overall results. So if you do have any further questions on inoculants, feel free to reach out to your local Winfield United rep, and we can answer any of those questions. Otherwise, make sure to check out our other videos here on YouTube to go through other agronomic answers here.